Hello, good evening. It's Selena Carty here, cultural and ancestral consultant, Afrocentric genealogist, founder of Black Pop Heroes. I hadn't sent out any kind of publications this week. Hi, Miss Antoinette. It's been a hard week for us this week in regards to, I guess, publishing things and putting things out there, as you can hear. We've been receiving a lot of interest for the work that we're doing, and so we've been doing this for 5 years. We've been doing this for 10 years now, and I was asked, how do I feel about what's going on with Black Lives Matters and the murder of George Floyd, and it impacted me in a way that I didn't understand that it would impact me, because I've been doing this work for 10 years now, because the significance behind educating and empowering our communities is something that's is personal to me as a Black woman, as an African woman, as a woman who identifies herself to being African, West Indian, Black British, and other, the other denominations that we're given to be able to identify who and how we express ourselves. But my upset was that now that we were given this opportunity to remember ourselves or to know ourselves, we're in a place where there are so many categories, so many boxes that we have to tick in or fill that we're a part of. It's like, where do we start? And I regularly, because of the genealogy side of the work that I do, I regularly I implore all people to start with yourselves. So what do you identify to be your culture? What do you identify to be how you understand yourself in the world? And then once we've looked at that, how do we now have a conversation together for me to understand you, for you to understand yourself, for you to be able to share that with me, for me to be able to share that with you. So today I wanted to talk about that, about, our thoughts and our opinions around continuously being subjected to ideologies around how we value our history, how we value our culture, how we value our contributions. Because when it comes to the work that I do, it was quite sensitive around us feeling that we should never have been a part of white men's wars, or we should never have been a part of these wars, or we should have never been a part of this, or we should have never been a part of that, or we shouldn't have done this, or we shouldn't have done that. But history shows us that there are reasons behind why we have been a part of wars, why we have been a part of certain infrastructures, why we've been a part of certain narratives. And the more we learn and the more we open and the more we understand, these things are open to us. And by them being open to us, it allows for us to have different conversations about these wars, about these contributions we've made, and about our ancestors. Because at the baseline of all the work that we do, it's about our ancestors, is what we're trying to ensure that we're remembering, because we are a present representation of those who came before us. So we are looking at their histories, their legacies, their conditioning, their trainings, the things that they went through, to understand how some of those things have passed on to us, how some of those things are impacting us. Hello, is it Iwis Arts? Thank you for joining me. And how we do that. So there's a couple of things, because I kind of want to put what we do into context, because we look at wars, we don't just look at military wars. We look at wars around economics, entertainment, education, labor, law, religion, sex, war, and counter war. So we're looking at how we have been impacted, how we are continuously impacted on the war front on all of these areas, and where we are within the world, how things have happened in the world for us to be in the positions that we're in. And it's not to look at it from a negative perspective, mind you. It's about looking at realistically how the infrastructures have been put in place and why things remain the same, but some things change, but the majority of it remains the same. And the mindsets and the ideology behind why it was put in place, how those are systematic to our disempowerment, and systematic to the fact that when we're talking about change, the change has to start with yourself, because everything around you is set to function in a certain way. So within history, we have different times, different contributing factors to certain things that have happened in history. So today I'm going to talk to you about the latter part of the 1700s. And I don't know if many of you know about a case called the Zong case. The Zong case was in 1781, and where the captain of the ship, he threw aboard 133 Africans of the ship because he had lost almost half of what he classified as his cargo because the other half of the African men and women, they were unwell. So for him to be able to claim insurance, he figured it was better for him to throw the rest of them overboard. So when they docked I think the ship was going to Jamaica. It's what the books tell us. So when they came back to England, because the ship was coming from Liverpool, they put in for a claim, an insurance claim for the cargo lost, not the lives lost, the cargo lost. And it happened that the crew members wouldn't allow that to happen because it was untrue. And as a result, they weren't able to claim money. But the fact that there were systems in place for you to claim back money on the African lives and cargo, classified as cargo in the latter part of the 1700s, allows me to understand, because again, I do the work from my perspective, allows me to understand that the frameworks that we still see today are frameworks of what was there yesteryear. But after we have the Zong case, we have the Haitian Revolution in 1791 to 1804. And due to the French Revolution taking place in the latter part of the 1700s, the African communities in Haiti understood themselves to be French. As a result of them being French and now France being free, France now being being free from the revolution, they too understood that they were free because they were French subjects. So this is what led to the Haitian Revolution. And we look at, how it started. We look at the religious aspect. We look at the spiritual aspect. So you have a man called Book Bandati, who was head of the kind of spiritual gathering and awakening to learn who would be a part of this war, who would be the leaders, who would be head of these things, and bringing that forward as a community. We learn about Toussaint Louverture, we learn about Jean-Jacques Dessalines, we learn about Henry Christophe, who were all a part of the same battalion regiment, and they were classified as friends who came up together. So they weren't initially the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. There were other men who were leaders, but they came up through the rankings to become leaders of the Haitian Revolution, and they are predominantly the names that we know of and we hear about today. But we're looking at how the African was fighting using the skill sets, using the resources from the Europeans, so from the Dutch, from the Spanish, from the French, from the English, to be able to get ahead, to be able to get independence. So when we're looking at Haiti being the first and only West Indian island or Caribbean island that gained independence through warfare, the rest of the islands that came on after, in 1962, we have Jamaica and Trinidad. This was political independence, as opposed to the independence that Haiti had been able to secure for themselves. However, when a lot of people don't know that Haiti had to repay back millions to France, because France had developed Haiti for it to be a working colony, for them to be able to generate money from. All of the West Indies was invested in for it to be a colony for whichever colonizer had owned it or had won it, because throughout the 1700s there were continuous warfares of backwards and forwards for the French and the British and the Spanish claiming and reclaiming islands that they had previously owned. But when we're looking at the Haitian Revolution, we're looking at how African men, Toussaint Louverture, who was an avid reader, who was an avid learner, who was an avid creator, who understood his African heritage, was able to come forward and lead his people into the liberation that we now know as Haiti's independence. Within that time, we also had the Second Maroon War in the West Indies, in Jamaica. And this would have included Nanny of the Maroons and Codjo. So they were leaders of the Leeward and the Windward Maroons in Caribbean. However, the war ended with the signing of a treaty on the 1st of January 1796, which is something that's celebrated within Maroon Town every year. I think it's on the 6th, I believe. We attended this year, so I've got a lot of documents and documentation and videos and images and information that I'm collating together to put together for our documentaries and for our written works. But war is something that has been systematic throughout the world and throughout time. So within that time, so we have the Zong case of the overthrowing of the African men and women classified as cargo, and the captain claiming back insurance. We have the Haitian Revolution, so the Africans understanding that they too are French subjects, so they too should be liberated, they should be free, and they're prepared to fight for that freedom. Then we have the Second Maroon War in 1795, looking at how the African communities coming from the ships that they say, that the last set of Africans were on the ships being dropped off in Jamaica. Sorry. But the men and women that they were classifying as Maroons were coming from various different tribes on the continent, and their fight against the British to ensure that they were able to have their own place, their own base, to be able to start thriving for themselves, start developing for themselves, was something that the British didn't feel that they deserved or that they should have, because wherever Europeans go, they want full reign of the world. They want full reign of the vicinities that they are occupying. But that takes us to 1795. But within that time, we also have the formation of the West India Regiment. So the West India Regiment is, to my knowledge, the first colonial regiment that was established and put in place by Britain to have a West Indian service force in the Caribbean, to be able to serve in the wars in the Americas, all over the West Indies against the French, and as well as on the continent of Africa. So within the work that we do, I've got a client that's working with us. Their great-great-grandfather served in the Anglo-Ashanti War, the last one in ended in 1900s. This is the one that would have included Ya Santewa, who we talked about last week. So her great-great-grandfather served for the West India Regiment, stationed in Sierra Leone, travelled to the Ashanti regions, which is now we know as Ghana or the Gold Coast at the time, and they were fighting against African-looking West Indians who are African by descent, fighting against Africans on the continent of Africa, but serving for different sides, serving for different kings and countries, serving for different understandings of what it means to be a part of a nation, what it means to be a part of something greater than oneself. So we have the histories of these men who didn't return back to the West Indies, didn't return back to Jamaica. They stayed and made families for themselves, and they stayed and they became a part of the culture. So we look at how their impact may have or has impacted the Western regions of Africa. So when you look at, people's understandings, their mindsets, things, it's all based on where you're coming from, what you've grown up with, what your understandings of who you are and what you represent. But we have those stories, and we're unearthing more of those stories in our new project, Our Ancestors Served. So Our Ancestors Served, I'm going to talk to you more about it next week and open up for questions throughout the week for you to be able to ask questions and see whether or not you want to become involved. But Our Ancestors Served is our new tagline for the projects that we're working on, because it is self-explanatory. Because when you hear Black Poppy Rose, it's, you're like, well, what do you do? What do you do? But Our Ancestors Served is literally Ron Seal. What it says is what it does on the tin. And we're looking at how our ancestors served, how our ancestors received when they were coming back, the mental health of our ancestors, how our ancestors grew the next generation. And then when the next generation served in the wars to follow, what was the understanding of why they were fighting, what they were fighting for. So when we look at what we've got today and we look at the impacts of the men and women who served in World War II and what they have done for the communities, whether or not they've been mayors, whether or not they've been in politics, whether or not they've been teachers, whether or not they've been entertainers on the television or news presenters or researchers or policemen and women, doctors, nurses, whatever occupation there is, how the practices from being in the army and the things that they've seen all over the world would have impacted their mindsets of how they've continued to develop and nurture a future generation. So with that being said, we're looking at the 1700s. So with the formation of the West India Regiment in 1795, just before then, in 1795, we have a man called Thomas Peters coming over to the United Kingdom. He was a black pioneer and a black loyalist from the Americas. He became a part of conversations being held with Ignatius Sancho, Olaudah Equiano and Granville Sharp around the plans to settle London's black poor under the province of freedom. They had set up an organisation for the Committee of the Relief of the Black Poor. And Thomas Peters was coming from the Americas. But what people don't know is that he had been talking about the removals of the Maroons after the Second Maroon War in 1795. So a lot of the Maroons were resettled in Nova Scotia. They were trying to resettle the black communities in Nova Scotia into Sierra Leone alongside the black poor of this country. So when we look at the mobilization, the formation of people and ideas, in my mind, from the work that I do, it made sense for Europeans to invest, because whether or not you were a slaver or whether or not you were an abolitionist, you still made money from slavery. You still made money from emancipating African people all over the world. Money was made on both sides. And as a result of that, we see the formation of the first British colony in West Africa in 1808. So Britain had been fighting against the Dutch and the Spanish, no, and the Portuguese for regions within that region. So when we look at, like Elamina Castle in the Gold Coast, Ghana, that used to be owned by the Dutch. It was built by the Dutch before the British had arrived. And when we went so I took my son, we were invited by the High Commissioner, the former High Commissioner, oh my goodness, Edward Toure. Yes, invited us to Sierra Leone. So we went, and then we were hosted by another family as well of EDF construction. So they deal with a lot of the road contracts. So they were able to take us all over Sierra Leone to be able to see the country, to see, some of the sites, see the beaches, see the roads, see the significant historic regions. But what we were able to learn is that Fabric College is classified as the first colonial university established in West Africa. And we were able to work with some of the teachers and scholars there to be able to see how we can develop programs with Black Poppy Rose to bring in Sierra Leone history. And a lot of the history has been destroyed since the civil war that took place. My dates fail me at the minute, but it was just before the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. They had just recovered after 10 years from having the internal civil war. And then 10 years after they've been able to, establish themselves back, then Ebola struck, which then took them back basically. So again, they had to rebuild again after the war, and then again after Ebola. But looking at the history, we were there celebrating with the Creole community who had come back to honor and remember their ancestry, and where areas where they had been removed from the continent, and remembering those legacies, remembering their ancestors talking about the stars, them being able to pinpoint how and where they've been taken from, and looking at the constellation of the stars, and them understanding that just because they weren't home, they were still able to connect with home because they understood the journey that they had undertaken. We also were there to witness the celebration of a church which was 200 years old. So imagine a church is celebrating 200 years on the continent of Africa from a European perspective, but what else is able to be celebrated from 300 years before that? What are we celebrating 300 years before that? Do we remember? Do we know? And the reason why Black Poppy Rose takes this narrative around the world is because when we look at the world, when we classify ourselves as Africans, unfortunately, we treat Africa as if it's a country and not a continent. And I fear, because we're taught about the United States of America being a country, and then because it has states, we then and all those states have their own laws and their own ways of doing things, we then use that model and classify the continent of Africa in the same way. So United States of America is a country, and then it has states within that country, as opposed to the continent of Africa being a continent and having countries within it. And when we talk about being African, when we talk about being West Indian, there isn't one size fits all, because all cultures are different. And we see that even throughout Europe, we see the difference with all cultures. We see the difference with all narratives, words, interpretations. You can offend somebody by saying something the opposite way around instead of, one way around, because where you're coming from, it means something to you, but it can mean something disrespectful to another community. So when we look at our histories, the idea is behind how we can start identifying the histories that are relevant, the histories that are significant to each and every group, to be able to consolidate that. Yes, it's going to be a lot. Yes, it is a lot of work, but I feel that we deserve, that I feel that the respect that we are looking for, we must start with ourselves. We must start with understanding what has happened systematically to us as people, as a community, as a race, as a racial classification, because all of these classifications that we have been given them, we have been gifted them by others who feel that they are in charge of us, and that we are their responsibility. And as a result of us being their responsibility, they must manage and count for us. They must, allow us to have the platforms to be able to share and spread our knowledge and our narratives. But at the same time, the atrocities and the traumas that come with learning about these histories, with understanding what has happened, how is that being supported? And I think the week that I've been having this week, is about looking at, now that we've been given permission to talk more about ourselves in the way that we understand and we want, where is that understanding of that, the traumas that we are carrying, the fact that we've been on mute almost, even though we are screaming at the top of our lungs, we've still been on mute. There are still things we have to accustomize ourselves to. We have to adjust. We have to think that if I say this or if I do this, something negative may happen, or something, I may be penalized from doing certain things. So when we're looking at our histories, it's very much about looking at the personal aspect of why that is significant for you. And by finding out why that's significant for you, you are then able and empowered to share that with others, saying, this is what I have to bring to the table. This is my narrative. This is from my perspective. This is how I feel about it. And not being told, well, you shouldn't feel that way, because we're regularly told and we're regularly taught that, your feelings need to be validated by somebody else for them to understand what you've gone through, or what you understand you've gone through. When in actual fact, your feelings don't need to be validated by anybody but yourself, because how you feel about certain things is based on your ancestral makeup, based on how you see the world, based on the things that you've experienced, you've gone through. And many of us don't have the time to think about all of those things and understand that when we are going through certain things, when certain things upset us, it's because we have issues that we have not dealt with, because we haven't understood how to deal with them. So the reason why I bring up the latter part of the 1700s is to give an understanding of, there are things that have always been going on that we have not understood. And as a result of not being able to understand them, we haven't been able to heal from the things that we don't understand. So when we get to 1808 and the establishment of the British colony in Sierra Leone, a year before that, we have, laws being put in place for the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. And again, I mentioned in a previous video that the abolition of the Slave Trade Act allowed England to make the Slave Trade Act illegal, and in turn they were taking the African men and women and children that were classified as cargo from the French, from the Dutch, from the Spanish, from the Portuguese, and they were enlisting them for lifelong service into their armies and into their labor camps. But yet when we celebrate the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, we're looking at, Europeans attempting to try and free us. And in our mind, we say to ourselves, why didn't they send us back to Africa? Because that costs money. That costs time. And where would you be sending them back to? Do you know where they came from? So when you're sending them back to Africa, where do they go from there? And then the conditionings that they've been forced to endure before they get there, the breaking, the psychological disempowerment, the shame, the trauma, all of those things, men being disempowered in front of their women being disempowered in front of their men to show that you are helpless, even more helpless than children, looking at that ancestral trauma that we still carry today in regards to the fact that we look at the world and we witness the murder of, George Floyd, another black man that the world has been able to witness, as well as everybody else who's continuously being murdered. But there's a sense of, helplessness that we have as a community, that this is continuing and this has been going on for over 500 years and it's still manifesting itself. So with the history we're trying to unearth is about looking at, King Kepra says they weren't thinking of us at all. At no point does any other group of people have to think about us, because what they're doing is to empower their way of life, their understandings, and how they go through what they go through, and the rest of us are pawns to meet their needs. But that's my perspective. I don't argue about with people's perspectives. I look at the work that I do, I study in the way that I study, and the idea is about educating and empowering our people on the facts of history that have been documented. We are all entitled to interpret the history in our own ways and do works in the way that we understand it, to be able to share that narrative, because what we're hungry for knowledge, but we've all got degrees, we've all got doctorates, we all go to school, but there's a certain aspect of information and knowledge that we're still craving for, that we're still looking for, that we're yearning for, that helps us to understand who we are, what we've been through, and what is our purpose here today. So the latter part of the 1700s, where we look at the different levels of what we consider to be revolutions and wars, mobilizations of servicemen. So on the continent of Africa, the earlier parts of just after the Berlin Conference, 1884-85, the men were enlisted into different army groupings, and police forces to police force the continent of Africa, these newfound borders. So we have the mobilization of them in the West Indies, and because it worked well, they were able to follow the same format on the continent of Africa. And as you're expanding, you need to expand your armies, you need to expand your police force, you need to expand those who are going to follow the governmental laws, and they're going to enforce those laws amongst the people. I think next week I'm going to take us through a little workshop that I do with, especially with young people who they love this workshop that I'm referring to. But I'm gonna take us through it next week, so we can have a discussion about it the week after. Because what I'm asking is, I'm gonna put out a campaign tomorrow, and I'd like you to ask any questions that you have in regards to what you want to hear about it, what you want to know about it, any information you want to hear further, as well as whether or not you want to come on board and support and help with the work that we are doing. How you can get in contact with us, info@blackpoppyrose.org. You can email us on all social medias. We are at Black Poppy Rose on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. If you'd like to become an ambassador in your local area to help us spread this information and knowledge, you email us. And if you want to be distributors of our pins, or if you want to distribute them in your stores, we offer... Thank you. My son said, yes, Mum, you're doing great. We offer all people incentives. So nobody works for us for free. We try and compensate as best as we can. Those of you who want to support and help us doing what we're doing, in turn, we are helping you to do what you're doing, and building a community around how we can support one another with capital, with support, with access to resources, and with developing tangible lifelong skills that we generally empower young people to have, so they have the ability to to communicate with different people of different levels or different ages, and not feel intimidated by somebody of a position and power, things like that. Yes, so if you're interested about learning more, sign up to our mailing list on www.blackpoppyrose.org, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you very much for your support. And Our Ancestors Served is what we're talking about next week. So please write questions, send them to us via our social media, and we will see you next week. Thank you.